And I have never felt like the enemy of the Vietnamese people. In fact, I have always felt like their friend. And I love this quote by Ho Chi Minh because he understood that really the war was up to the Americans. If the Americans wanted to continue to fight the war, then the Vietnamese would continue to fight for their independence until they won. And if they didn't want to, then they would stop the war, and then they'd sit down and they'd drink tea and they would shake hands and become friends afterwards. Hi, this is Anita from the Dusty Roads podcast. Yeah, if any of you have been listening to me, you know that I love history and I really do appreciate history. And that one of the things that I wanted to talk about today is, could America have won the Vietnam War? And I want to talk about this, especially when you think about many of the events which are happening today throughout the world, in particular with Russia and Ukraine. And I've had several discussions with people about this as we've talked about some of the world events. And as I've done this blog about, could America, and answer this question, could America won the Vietnam War? Yeah, before I started traveling to Vietnam, and I started going there the first time in the early 1900s, and that really, I know, does date me as to how, old I am. But I remember going there, and this was way before the Americans even had any type of diplomatic relations there. And I remember going in there as an American and feeling like, wow, these people were actually our enemies. And I didn't feel it at all. I felt zero animosity ever from any Vietnamese. And in fact, all the years that I've lived there, I can say as an American, I have never felt any animosity about America and the war and what happened there from the Vietnamese people. And I just want to point that out because I think that is an amazing thing. And it is something which many Americans wonder, like, how can you live in Hanoi, Vietnam? I mean, some of them still today are like, they're your enemies. How can you do that? And I'm like, yeah, but you don't understand. I have felt no animosity there. In fact, in many cases, they love me because I'm American. They have really put the war behind them. Many U.S. historians believe, and I tend to believe with them, that the Vietnam War was a war that America could never have won. Essentially, America was backing the wrong power. And we totally discounted the fact that Ho Chi Minh, or as the Vietnamese affectionately call him, Uncle Ho, was such a powerful leader for the North Vietnamese that they believed in him so much and his cause that even in the South, many of the Vietnamese believed in him and what he was saying to them. And there's some quotes here I wanted to quote him. He said of the war, "Our resistance will be long and painful, but whatever the sacrifices, however long the struggle, we will fight to the end until Vietnam is full, independent, and unified." Right there, Ho Chi Minh is saying is, you can come in and you can bomb the heck out of us, which we did because we put more bombs on Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia than all the bombs that were used during World War II. There were bombs constantly being bombarded on North Vietnam. But yet, Ho Chi Minh understood that America would never win the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese people. And as I think about this today, this actually makes me think a little bit about Ukraine today. And as you see the things that are going on there and with Russia, and it really makes me realize that in many ways, Zelensky is a bit like Ho Chi Minh. Not the fact that Ho Chi Minh was communist or any of that. I'm not saying that at all, but I'm talking about the power of the personality and just how many of the Ukrainian people feel that they're willing to fight and die for their country. And that was the way that it was during the Vietnam War among the Vietnamese. America could not have won the Vietnam War because they would never have won the hearts of the Vietnamese people. That right there is the key, that they would never have won the hearts of the Vietnamese people. Yes, we could have maybe have invaded North Vietnam and we could have tried to force submission, but there would never have been true peace there. And that's kind of a little bit of what I feel when I see the events going on today in Ukraine that I feel like even if Russia, if it takes over the whole country, will never win the hearts and minds of the Ukrainian people. And they will continue to fight for their independence until they actually get it. You know, it was Ho Chi Minh who said this: "You can kill 10 of our men for every one we kill of yours. But even at those odds, you will lose and we will win." He understood that even at the odds of 1 to 10, that there would be 10 Vietnamese that would die for every one American, that they would still win the war. And I believe in the end it was something like that. There was over 2 million Vietnamese that died during that war, and I think it was over 250,000 or so American soldiers. But even at those odds, with the tremendous amount of life that was lost on the Vietnamese side, he still understood that they would still, in the end, win that war. You know, one of the reasons was that the South Vietnamese government was weak and it was corrupt, and America was backing the South Vietnamese. And the South Vietnamese government at the time during the Vietnam War didn't inspire anybody to want to follow them at all. In fact, they knew they were corrupt. They knew that this was a bunch of men who didn't care about anybody, essentially about themselves. And, you know, and even though there were several leaders and they kept changing leaders, there was never a leader that was as inspiring and as dynamic as Ho Chi Minh was. You know, it's Ho Chi Minh who said that it was patriotism, not communism, that inspired me. And I really believe that, having done some study about him and his life, that he became communist more of necessity because the communists were willing to support him, that at the end, he was patriotic. He wanted freedom for Vietnam and the Vietnamese people. He became a very dynamic leader. He went on and he said, Ho Chi Minh went on and said, "The Vietnamese people deeply love independence, freedom, and peace. But in the face of United States aggression, they have risen up united as one man." He also understood this power, that the Vietnamese wanted their freedom and independence. And he, as a leader, gave them this vision that they could have their independence, that they could become a free people, that they could rule themselves. Yes, even if it was a socialist system or a communist system, but they would still have that power within their own hands. And they believed that, and they believed in him. And he had that dynamic side that he was able to lead the Vietnamese people to victory. And he also understood that the Americans and the West would never be able to control the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese people. That is why he also said at one point, he said, "Everything depends on the Americans. If they want to make war for 20 years, then we will make war for 20 years. If they want to make peace, then we shall make peace and shall invite them to tea afterwards." I really love this quote, and this is probably one of my favorite quotes, because this is kind of the way that I have felt as an American living and working in North Vietnam. I have never, as I've said at the beginning of this, felt any animosity towards me as an American. I have never had a Vietnamese say to me like, "Oh, you're American, you're my enemy." Not once. In fact, it has been quite the opposite. It's always been like, "Oh, you're American. We love America." And I have never felt like the enemy of the Vietnamese people. In fact, I have always felt like their friend. And I love this quote by Ho Chi Minh because he understood that really the war was up to the Americans. If the Americans wanted to continue to fight the war, then the Vietnamese would continue to fight for their independence until they won. And if they didn't want to, then they would stop the war, and then they'd sit down and they'd drink tea and they would shake hands and become friends afterwards. I really feel like this is sort of an important thing to understand, especially in light of many of the events that's happening today. And, you know, I don't know yet. I don't have a glass ball to be able to see into the future. I don't know what is going to happen with the future between Ukraine and Russia. I honestly do not know. But what I do know and what I do understand is I do believe that it is going to be really hard for Russia to ever control the hearts and minds of the Ukrainian people, just like it would have been impossible for the Americans to ever truly control the Vietnamese people if we had won the war. That the Vietnamese wanted to have their independence at all costs, that they were willing to fight until the last man standing to make sure that they received it. I also understand that Ho Chi Minh was a dynamic personality that inspired the Vietnamese people and made them want to win the war and to have the independence from all foreign powers. This is Anita from the Dusty Roads podcast. We hope that you've enjoyed this podcast and that you will join with us. Check out our blog, Could America Have Won the Vietnam War? And then learn more and discover more about why I believe America could never have won that war. And history has really shown that to be true, that it was an unwinnable war from the American side. We hope that you've enjoyed this and that you'll tell your friends about us and that you'll continue to listen to our podcast. Thank you so much for listening. We truly do appreciate you and your support.